Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, Big Tech's Capitol Hill mea culpa, our deep dive on Facebook, Google, and Twitter's testimonies in Washington. Top lawyers from each tech giant answer questions on what one senator calls the national security question of the 21st century. Plus, Apple and Qualcomm's legal battle over patent licensing takes another nasty turn. We consider the beef from both sides and the implications for future iPhones and iPads. And a watershed moment for Bitcoin. Why the CME Group reversed course today, planning to introduce Bitcoin futures by the end of the year. But first to our lead. Facebook, Twitter, and Google are having their day on Capitol Hill. Top lawyers from all three appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee's Crime and Terrorism Subcommittee to answer how Russia manipulated their platforms to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential elections. Facebook, Google, and Twitter executives told Congress they aren't sure they've measured the full extent of Russia's manipulation of social networks in last year's U.S. presidential campaign, and they don't yet have the technology to prevent it from happening again.
We have found that foreign actors used fake accounts to place ads on Facebook and Instagram that reached millions of Americans over a 2-year period, and that those ads were used to promote pages, which in turn posted more content. People shared these posts, spreading them still further. Many of these ads and posts are inflammatory. Some are downright offensive.
We have uncovered more accounts linked to the Russian-based Internet Research Agency as a result of our review. We also determined that advertising by Russia Today and 7 small accounts was related to the election and violated either the policies that existed at the time or that have since been implemented.
We believe that the relatively limited amount of activity we found is a result of the safeguards that we had in place in advance of the election. Google's products also don't lend themselves to the kind of targeting or viral dissemination that these actors seem to prefer. But we are committed to continuing to improve our existing security measures to help prevent that kind of abuse.
Joining me now to discuss, Sarah Fryer, who covers Facebook for Bloomberg News and was at today's hearings. Also with me here in the studio, Mark Bergen, who covers Google for Bloomberg News. Sarah, I want to start with you. What were the key takeaways from the hearing so far today?
I think that opening testimony was one of the only times that the tech companies had the upper hand. For the remainder of the time, senators just poked holes in their promises. You know, the companies came presenting themselves as prepared and proactive and committed to making sure that this doesn't happen in the future. What the senators were able to gauge from the testimony was just that they don't currently and may never have the full capacity to prevent this from happening again. So it was really a very revealing testimony, and also I think the scope for which this is a problem just became a lot more clear.
Mark, one of the interesting differentiations that Google finally made today in public was that Google is very different from Facebook and Twitter, and that they made the claim that the protections they already have in place prevented some of this stuff from spreading. It in fact spread, they said, on social media.
Right. I mean, they don't have Google Plus much anymore. I think that Google's claim here has been, you know, they've identified a much smaller pool of ads than Facebook and Twitter, and a much smaller pool of accounts. You did see some really targeted questions around YouTube, in particular Russian Today, which is, you know, the Congress and a lot of Democratic senators have been very adamant that this is a propaganda tool for the Russian government. It's a very popular YouTube channel. The Google lawyer today sort of evaded questions about that and about kind of how much money Google flows. They haven't said how much money Google shares with their ad revenue with Russia Today.
You know, on top of that, they didn't just talk about Russia, but they talked about the threat from foreign actors in general. China, Iran, North Korea. There was a particularly heated exchange between Senator Kennedy and one of the lawyers. Take a listen to that.
How about North Korea? Turn that off.
I'm not aware of other foreign actors running the same sort of campaign.
How can you be aware? I mean, this is what I mean. You've got 5 million advertisers, and you're going to tell me that you're able to trace the origin of all of those advertisements?
Facebook General Counsel Colin Stretch, Sarah, taking a long pause there before attempting to answer that question. You know, how many times do you think we saw them caught unawares today?
You know, there were some other great exchanges just like that about North Korea, and there was, in particular, Senator Franken saying that, you know, trying to get Colin Stretch to say that Facebook would stop accepting political ads in North Korean currency, and Colin Stretch said, well, you know, if we did that, then you know, any foreign actor could just change the currency they're buying ads in. He wouldn't commit to doing that, and it got pounded pretty hard for it. And there was another time when you know, a company was talking about the signals, or all the companies were talking about how the foreign currency might be a good signal for them. And Senator Franken again was like, what do you mean signals? We're talking about illegal activity. Foreign spending on advertising to influence the U.S. election is illegal. And so there were a lot of reminders like that that just kind of put the companies in their place. Or at least the senators were trying to present this as a matter of law, not a matter of signals and data mining and what the companies see as their role.
Which brings us to the question of responsibility and whether or not these companies can actually deliver on this very big and critical responsibility. Take a listen to another exchange with Senator Klobuchar.
While you are taking responsibility for a lot of what's happened here and trying to make some changes, there wouldn't be an outside enforcer of any of your policies, right? It'll just be you. Is that true? Not you personally, but your companies. Okay. Can someone answer? Sorry.
That's correct.
That's correct. Mark, you know, talk about the ability of these companies to actually deliver on this responsibility. Can they meet the challenge?
Right. A lot of them mentioned, you know, we have fabulous machine learning tools, and we're now putting both humans and our AI to those resources. You know, if you talk to their advertisers, Facebook and Google have had some pretty big screw-ups in the past year about measuring metrics. So there are people that say they can't really grade their own homework when it comes to just basic core advertising, let alone, you know, propaganda, these Russian-backed attacks.
Sarah, a big question has been, when will these companies, especially Facebook, release information on targeting, who these ads were targeted to? Sheryl Sandberg said a few weeks ago that Facebook promised to be very transparent on this point. We still, however, have not heard from Sheryl Sandberg or Mark Zuckerberg, and several lawmakers expressed disappointment that they weren't on Capitol Hill today. When are we going to see that information?
Well, there were a lot of questions about timeline here and not a lot of answers. The companies overall were saying, you know, we will be communicative, we'll keep in touch with your staff, we'll look into what you're asking about and get back to you. You know, there were a lot of questions about what the targeting looked like, but also, you know, who was manipulated? Do we know if people actually made decisions based on this? And the company said, well, you know, we're really focused on the content on our platforms. We don't know what people decided based on this, and the senators didn't quite take that as an answer.
Another round of hearings, Sarah, coming up tomorrow with the House Intelligence Committee. What are we expecting?
Well, this hearing was more broadly focused, not just on the Russia situation, but on foreign threats in general. Tomorrow we'll get much more in the weeds on this particular pre-election situation, and I expect a lot more questions on whether they know anything about how the Internet Research Agency got their data. There was a question about that today, but of course that is what would give the Intelligence Committees a link to whatever political campaign may have been working with them, if any. So I think it could get even more heated tomorrow.
All right, Sarah Friar, you'll be covering those hearings for us yet again on Capitol Hill. Mark Bergen here in the studio covers Google for us. Thank you both. We will have much more reaction and analysis on today's hearings later in the show. And just a reminder, Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News, is developing a global breaking news video network for Twitter. Meantime, Facebook also disclosed that a Russian group spent $100,000 on ads to influence the 2016 presidential election. How did they do it? It's actually more simple than you might think. Sarah Friar filed that report.
Facebook
tells us that a Russian group spent $100,000 on ads to influence the 2016 presidential election. How do they do it? It's actually very simple. There are only 3 things you need to run a very sophisticated advertising campaign: a Facebook account, the ad itself, and a credit card. Facebook's website holds your hand through the rest through its self-service advertising system. Let's say you have an ad that you want to show to gun owners in Pennsylvania. Simple. Facebook can route your ad to everyone who lists their home state in Pennsylvania and has purchased a gun or read posts and pages about gun ownership. You can target ads based on race, political affiliation, education level, pretty much anything. Facebook can target specific demographic groups because it has so much information on its users. The articles they click on, the pages they follow, the things they like, all of it is recorded for later targeting by advertisers. There's also the information the users provide themselves, like what town they're from and what school they went to. This self-service ad purchasing tool is how the Russian group called the Internet Research Agency ran its campaigns. The ads are meant to stir up controversy over immigration, race relations, gun rights, and more. Facebook says that before ads are distributed, they're sent for review, but it's a mostly automatic process that doesn't really block controversial ads based on the content of the ad, which means the Russians were able to run thousands of ads with factually incorrect information and inflammatory political speech, which Facebook users couldn't tell came from Russia. And the Russian group created fake accounts and pages to run the ads, which looked like they were just coming from concerned US citizens. Just a little bit of money goes a long way. With $100,000, the Russia group was able to reach 10 million people. Remember that swing states in the election were won by mere thousands of votes.
I don't want anyone to use our tools to undermine democracy.
Facebook recently said that to prevent election manipulation in the future, it plans to hire 1,000 humans to help review ads that are politically or racially targeted. But they still haven't said exactly what the review parameters will be.
Once again there, Bloomberg's Sarah Fryer reporting. All right, coming up, the patent dispute between Apple and Qualcomm heating up. Now the iPhone maker could turn to Intel or MediaTek, leaving the chip maker behind. We will have all the details. And Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Bloomberg Tech TV, weekdays, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg. Canadian startup Shopify reported an earnings beat for the 10th quarter in a row, and the company raised its full-year outlook. Shopify provides tools for merchants to sell online through their own websites and third-party marketplaces like Amazon and eBay, but the stock fell in the session on concerns over sustainability. Remember, short seller Andrew Left with Citron Research called the company a get-rich-quick scheme. Well, Apple is taking its patent licensing dispute with Qualcomm to another level. According to a person familiar with the matter, Apple is designing iPhones and iPads that don't use Qualcomm components, something the iPhone maker has been doing since 2010. However, the product plans are apparently in the early stages and may still change, and while it's still being decided, Apple may use modem chips from Intel and MediaTek instead of Qualcomm's. Shares of Qualcomm sank more than 6% today on these reports. That's the worst performance in 10 months. Here with more detail, Bloomberg Technology's Ian King. So Qualcomm chips are in the current iPhone, in the iPhone 10, but there's a threat. How big is this threat? They won't be in the next iPhone.
I mean, it depends whether you really believe what's going on here. It's a long, long way until they really have to make that decision. That said, if they are already designing these things, then it's definitely possible. In terms of scaling it, analysts reckon that it's about $1.7, $1.8 billion of revenue a year from Apple to Qualcomm. That's about 7% of its total sales, so that's not to be sniffed at.
Do you believe it, or do you think this is just posturing?
It's Qualcomm's earnings tomorrow. Ask yourself, why did this come out? That is certainly a viewpoint that several people have expressed to me. You got to remember the most recent thing that we heard from Qualcomm was them dropping the nuclear bomb of trying to ban Apple's sales of the iPhone in China, the manufacture in China. So just when it seems like they've reached the bottom point for their relationship, they managed to find another layer of
Obviously, investors aren't excited about this for Qualcomm. Take a look at the terminal, the chart, G hashtag BTV7413. You can see how since this dispute started, the divergence in Apple shares and Qualcomm shares just sinking. This has not been good news for Qualcomm.
No, they've been massacred this year. I mean, it's the worst performing chip stock on the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. You know, that's a benchmark index, and that's in a year when chip stocks have been hot. You know, have done really well. Everybody apart from Qualcomm has had money pouring in. Clearly, people are massively concerned. This is Qualcomm's biggest, most profitable business is the licensing. If that goes away, they're in real trouble.
If Apple does pivot to these other companies, is there any quality change? Is there any change at all?
Yeah, I mean, and this is why some of the analysts have been rather cynical about this latest development. They've said, would you really want to dump Qualcomm's modems? They're basically the best chips in town when it comes to connecting to those networks, to getting that high-speed data. Why would Apple want to take that away from itself? Why would it want the risk that Samsung comes along and says, hey, our phones are faster?
Worst case scenario for Qualcomm, what's their backup plan?
Their backup plan is to put more and more money into their research and development efforts to help the Chinese manufacturers, to help Samsung, to help everybody who competes against Apple. In China, that has actually been relatively successful. Both Samsung and Apple have kind of lost market share to these Chinese manufacturers, but on a short-term basis, nobody wants to give that Apple revenue away.
So what are you expecting to hear from the company tomorrow in earnings?
It's again, I've been speaking to several people ahead of time. There isn't really an awful lot they can say other than to say earnings are this bad. You know, the strategy that they have in place, the legal disputes that they have in place are going to take a while to work out, to assert themselves, to see whether they can win any ground back, bring Apple to the negotiating table, get this all settled, and get some licensing revenue back. So that you're looking at probably next year before we see anything materially get better, and if that's the course it takes.
All right, well, I know you'll keep us apprised along the way. Ian King, who covers chips for us and for Bloomberg Technology, thanks so much. Coming up, the status of Bitcoin as a legitimate financial asset may be rising even faster than its price. We'll bring you details next. This is Bloomberg. The world's biggest exchange operator, CME Group, plans on introducing Bitcoin futures by the end of the year. The digital currency surged after the announcement. The move could help professional traders and investors get more seriously involved in the cryptocurrency. The contract will settle in cash and be based on the CME CF Bitcoin reference rate. Earlier this month, CME Group Chairman and CEO Terry Duffy spoke with Bloomberg's Scarlett Fu about getting into the crypto world. Take a listen.
If we decide to get into the crypto business under the rules that we have in place here at CME, so the margin rules, the spec rules, and everything else that we can apply to it with our distribution, I think we could be quite successful in the crypto world if we go down that path.
Sticking with Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency has passed yet another milestone. Its total value now just over $100 billion. Fundstrat's head of research, Tom Lee, one of the biggest bulls on Bitcoin, says he sees the Bitcoin Investment Trust tripling by 2022. He spoke earlier today with the Daybreak Americas team.
What Bitcoin is at the core is a new way to maintain a database, because it's introducing the concept of decentralization, so that nobody is centrally controlling information. It's all distributed on the nodes. But they achieve this because of encryption, which is personalized encryption. So, I mean, at the core, Bitcoin is essentially a huge innovation in the way data is made secure.
Tom, do you use Bitcoin to purchase things?
I do not, but I also don't use gold bars to buy things either, right? So I think the reality is that you can't use, if something is viewed as an alternate currency, you can't dismiss it just because it's not easy to spend. I'm going to give you an example. The UK economy is roughly $7 trillion. Guess how many pounds are actually in circulation today?
Well, that just means that, frankly,
it's about 77 billion pounds, which means there's a 100-to-1 multiplier on every unit of the pound is multiplied 100 times through leverage. So, you know, you might technically say most people are spending pounds digitally, right? So I don't think it's, I think people are conflating that issue when they say you can't spend it, therefore it's not either store value or legitimate currency.
But if the blockchain technology is revolutionary, that's different from Bitcoin being sort of the vehicle for how that is used. What gives you faith that Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think that's something we've heard a lot. I've been fortunate to spend quite a lot of time with a lot of the businesses that have really developed in the space. And I think what people have to appreciate is that Bitcoin has drawn the most passion among qualified developers. I mean, I'd say if you look at the development community in coding, there are more people developing things on Bitcoin than blockchain. So to me, Bitcoin is blockchain.
That was Fundstrat's head of research, Tom Lee, on Bloomberg Daybreak Americas. Coming up, if you like Bloomberg News, you can check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. We'll also have more on the hearings with tech companies before Washington. That is next. This is Bloomberg.
I'm Elisa Parenti in Washington, and you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with a check of your first word news. We have more on the developing story out of New York. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio is expected to hold a news conference at the headquarters of the NYPD this hour. Police report 8 people were killed and several wounded after a rented truck veered into a bike lane in Lower Manhattan and struck several pedestrians. A suspect is in custody. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley says there is an underlying motive behind Russia's interference in the U.S. electoral process. The Iowa senator spoke today to Bloomberg.
They aren't interested in who runs these countries. They're interested in discouraging confidence in the democratic process because they're autocratic and they don't like democracy because democracy might sneak into Russia and challenge Putin. That's what they're up against. That's what they're fighting.
The AP today confirmed the identities of 2 foreign nationals linked to Russia and Trump former campaign advisor George Papadopoulos. Emails obtained by the AP reportedly show that George Papadopoulos' conversations were with Joseph Mifsud and Ivan Timofeev. Mifsud is a professor and honorary director of the London Academy of Diplomacy. Timofeev is a director of programs at the Russian International Affairs Council. Neither were named in court papers filed by Robert Mueller. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Elisa Parenti. This is Bloomberg. Oh, I'm sorry. We are going to go to Paul, is in Sydney. Paul Allen's got a check of the markets. Paul, tell us what's going on there.
Thanks, Elisa. Well, U.S. equities closed higher. We've got Apple hitting a record high and West Texas intermediate higher as well. Not really filtering through to New Zealand, though. The NZX been trading for 30 minutes Wednesday morning, currently off 0.1%. We do have Nikkei futures stronger by 0.1%, though, as we wait on earnings from Japan Tobacco and Honda Motor. Futures here in the ASX also higher by 0.4%. This is after we've seen the iron ore price slip again, now $58.63 a tonne. The Aussie dollar slipping to 76.5 US cents as well. All of this a symptom of the ongoing anti-pollution drive in China. And it's that anti-pollution drive that saw the official PMI gauge fall on Tuesday. We're getting the Taishan gauge coming out today for October. That covers the smaller private export-oriented firms. That's expected to hold steady at 51. I'm Paul Allen in Sydney. More from Bloomberg Technology next.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. We are continuing our coverage of big tech testimony on Capitol Hill today regarding alleged Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Senator Lindsey Graham minced no words about how important this topic is.
What we have to be on guard as a nation is having people who want to undermine our way of life using these platforms against us. And I think this is the national security challenge of the 21st century.
Joining me now to discuss, Tara Muller, the Senior Policy Advisor for the Counterterrorism Project. Tara, thank you so much for joining us. So talk to us about this through, your experience in national security and how critical a role these companies actually play in national security in general.
Sure. Well, I just left the Senate. I was in the room for most of the hearing. I left a little early to get over here. But basically, they have a big role to play, and they've been a little bit resistant towards playing a role. But I think it was clear today as the members on both sides of the aisle were really pressing them on issues not just related to Russian interference in the election, but other countries online operating in problematic fashions, terrorist groups, extremists using their platforms in ways that are violating the terms of service, in ways that are causing national security concerns, and in ways that are threatening to undermine our democracy in terms of our elections. So I think you heard a range of issues of concern. Obviously, the focus has been on Russia, but really the tech companies are starting to come under scrutiny, and that's Twitter, Facebook, and Google, not just for ad purchasing problems by, Russians and their inability to track who's making these purchases, but also terrorist groups like ISIS using these platforms and engaging in problematic activities and putting up problematic content as well, all over the globe.
There were a lot of questions and not as many answers. I mean, how satisfied were you with the answers that you heard from these lawyers today?
Sure. I think that, there's been progress made from where we were about a year or so ago, but I think the answers were still somewhat unsatisfactory. I mean, at the end of the day, you're talking about a global platform here, and you're talking about companies that weren't initially set up to deal with these problems. So I think it's becoming clearer and clearer now that there's going to need to be some accountability, whether that comes in the form of legislation, whether that comes in the form of reporting requirements or more transparency. And you see, legislation now out of the Senate regarding ads, and I think you're going to potentially see more areas where you're going to see congressional involvement. You also see pressure out of the EU on some of these companies in terms of getting extremist and terrorist content off their platforms, and in terms of monitoring who's buying their buying their ads. In the case of the ad buying, for example, it's likely that campaign laws were being broken, and I think you're going to see legislation, and you are seeing legislation respond to that. I think we have a ways to go. I think it's good that there's an admission. The first, sign of dealing with a problem is admitting there's a problem. So I think you have the admission now that the tech companies are realizing that they're going to need to deal with this. The question becomes sort of how far and how quickly they're going to be able to get a grasp on some of these issues. Again, not just in terms of the election, but many problematic behaviors and activities on their platforms.
How do you suggest these companies handle dealing with this extremist content or ads purchased by foreign actors? I mean, Facebook says it's doubling its security staff, for example. Is this something that you believe these companies can do on their own, or is government intervention necessary here?
Sure. I think there can be a lot more that's done on their own. I mean, if you look at other issue areas where there was pressure on them, they did sort of change and become more aggressive. So child pornography is a good example, where they use technology to prevent the upload of problematic child pornographic imagery, which is illegal and also not permitted on their platforms. They can do a similar thing. We've been pushing a Counter-Extremism Project for them to do a similar prevention of upload for the worst terrorist content using the same technology that they use on child pornography. For example, you could build a database and basically prevent certain content from ever being online. In terms of the ad buying, they're really going to need to start. I know a lot of these companies pride themselves on people being anonymous or being able to have anonymity on Twitter, for example. But when you have election campaign laws and you have people purchasing a product, in this case an ad, via your platform, you need to have transparency about who that is. So I think if you don't see them being proactive on some of these issues, they're actually going to probably end up having to face legislation and more regulation on these issues. So it seemed like on the Hill today, the senators were suggesting that they're sort of taking them at their word, but not really trusting that they're going to necessarily go as far as they need to without some sort of legislative solutions on some of these issues.
Your proposal to approach this content the same way they approach child pornography, is that realistic on a scale note? I mean, is the scale of the child pornography problem anything compared to the volume of extremist content that we're talking about here?
Well, actually, on the child pornography side of the equation, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children houses a database of about 30,000 child pornographic images that have been funneled there via law enforcement, tech companies, and whatnot. So those images have prevented the upload of tens of millions of images onto these platforms. A similar approach can be taken, for example, with the worst brutal extremist ISIS content put into a database and have the same technology preventing that from being uploaded. So I think it is a good analogy. It's one that I think is an applicable solution and fix on the counterterrorism front.
Tara, what do you make of the lawmakers bringing up not just Russia, but other foreign actors like China, like Iran, like North Korea?
Well, that's actually a really good question, and that question was brought up by senators during the hearing, where they actually asked the company executives testifying if they could sort of give numbers or had a sense of if other countries were doing this. It seems like they didn't really have a grasp of the data, but it did seem that there was an admission that, yes, countries like Iran, countries like North Korea can all do what Russia was doing. So unless there are mechanisms put in place to prevent this from happening, it's going to be a problem not just in terms of election cycles, but for all sorts of problematic, false, misleading, and potentially damaging national security content on their platforms, whether that's counterintelligence, operations, or whether that's election interference down the line, misinformation campaigns, or terrorist or extremist bomb-making videos, for example. All of this can cause many problems, not just here in the United States, but all around the globe.
All right, Tara Mahler, Senior Policy Advisor for the Extremism Project. Tara, as always, great to have you here on the show. A reminder that Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News, is developing a global breaking news video network for Twitter, which, of course, Twitter's top lawyer testified today on Capitol Hill. Samsung Electronics announced its biggest profit ever, with net income totaling about $9.9 billion in the third quarter. The numbers were boosted by a surge in global chip prices, with its semiconductor division accounting for about 2/3 of its operating income. And there was a shakeup at the top. CFO Lee Sang-hoon will become chairman at the tech giant. It is the first time Samsung has split up the chairman and CEO duties, and there will be new CEOs for its semiconductor, mobile, and consumer electronics division. Coming up, the merging of tech and Wall Street has ramped up this year thanks to automation and AI. We will hear from Citadel Securities Chief Information Officer on the role tech plays at the firm. This is Bloomberg. With machine learning and automation, the use of new technology has never been more important for financial firms. As Chief Information Officer at Citadel Securities, Nawaf Bitar is responsible for implementing the market-making technology driving the securities business at Citadel, but he also got his start in Silicon Valley. He talks about his journey to Wall Street with Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker.
Well, that's an interesting story. As you observed, most of my time has been in the Valley. Companies like Network Appliance, Cisco, Juniper, most recently VMware. And the thing that was most interesting to me about Citadel Securities is that they afforded me an opportunity, they afforded me a license to innovate. It's one of the few things that really excites the technologist, being able to develop and deploy leading technologies in networking, storage, compute, and bringing it all together at the same time. The second thing that was interesting to me is that I found such a high concentration of talent. People talk about hiring the best and the brightest. What I found at Citadel Securities is we've set the bar so high in terms of who we bring in that we are actually bringing in those types of people. And having those types of people around you up-levels your game, and I found that to be the case with me. And then the final thing, which was a bit of a surprise, was we are able to deploy new technologies in days and weeks, as opposed to the months and years that I've been accustomed to. And technologists just love seeing their creations come to market.
You make it sound like this is a faster-paced, more exciting environment than what everyone thinks, right, is the Holy Grail.
I mean, candidly, it's like as much a tech firm as any company I've ever worked at. And, so tremendous amount of excitement and a tremendous amount of innovation.
What specifically about your background, your skills, your expertise did Citadel need?
Well, Citadel Securities, we value a diversity of experiences, and if you only have people coming out of the fintech sector, for example, they think a certain way. Bringing in people with different perspectives from different companies and different experiences, that allows us different insights, which we can then apply to our core mission.
But I'm thinking, you've worked in networking, as you mentioned, you worked in storage and more. What are you applying most here?
Well, one of the interesting things is that we're bringing them all to bear. Literally, networking is fundamental to our business. Compute and analysis is fundamental to our business. The way we acquire and store data is fundamental to our business. Unlike other places I've been, we bring it all together and use it all at once.
Help explain why. Help people understand the role that technology plays in a market-making firm like Citadel Securities.
Right. So our core mission, of course, is to provide liquidity, to provide for a stable, efficient, transparent market, and we use technologies in many different ways. I'll give you a few examples. In equities, for example, we do analysis that allows us to provide the best liquidity, particularly in illiquid markets. It enables us to optimize our costs so we can provide a more efficient, cost-effective transaction to our clients. It enables us to fulfill our obligations as a designated market maker on the New York Stock Exchange. For the 1,400 or so symbols that we represent, we use our technology to enable a prompt and smooth opening and close. And then, on the institutional side, we're able to stream live pricing. Our technology enables us to do that as well.
So if technology is, call it the X factor, right? One of the principal things that separates good executors from bad ones, I have to believe there's something of an arms race going on, right? More, better, faster, more powerful.
Certainly it applies to the infrastructure that we deploy and the technology we deploy, but perhaps even more importantly, it applies to the people that we hire. And so, we look to bring in people from tech centers and tech companies across the world.
You're doing more of that.
We are doing more of that just this year. And, again, given a high bar, this is an impressive number. Just this year, we've hired over 20 people from traditional tech firms. We're actually looking to connect with people even before they graduate. We've held 20 datathons across the world, and we're able to connect with those students in that forum, and we've been able to hire some of those as well.
Where are the happy hunting grounds? Where do you want to hire people from?
I mean, the obvious, we'll hire good people from anywhere in the world, but, for traditional tech people, the concentrations, of course, are in Silicon Valley, in the Seattle area, in Austin, Texas.
At the obvious, like at the Googles, at the Facebooks, at the companies of that nature?
And also many of the startups as well. And, as I said at the beginning.
So you're raiding Silicon Valley?
Absolutely, but we're being very selective about it.
Talk to me, Nawaf, about the innovations, right? Technology is all about innovation and I suppose disruption as well, terms that people like to throw around. But talk to me about the innovations that you're implementing now and anticipate implementing that will prove to be disruptive in securities trading.
Well, clearly, data is at the heart of what we do, as is technology, and our ability to analyze and, glean insights from that data is fundamental. People, no doubt, talk about cloud computing all the time. Cloud computing provides you an elasticity that can be a force multiplier to a business. It allows you to expand into resources for periods of time when you couldn't possibly afford to own them, not cost effectively anyway, on an ongoing basis. But those are the types of things that we look at.
What about machine learning?
Machine learning is definitely the buzz du jour, and it's something we deploy today.
How?
A lot of folks don't understand it. They might not understand how it's distinguished from artificial intelligence. I think of machine learning as a state of the art, if you will, in artificial intelligence. What you're able to do is look at past patterns of data and correlate them with known outcomes that occurred in the past. I actually like to use the expression, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. So, we can train a model based on what happened in the past, correlate it to the known outcomes that were associated with that, and then use that technology to predict what would happen in response to an unanticipated set of circumstances, and improve the model over time because we provide feedback. That's the learning aspect of machine learning, and we do deploy that in many areas of our business to get more insight into the decisions that we make.
That was Nawaf Bitar, Chief Information Officer at Citadel Securities, speaking to our own Eric Schatzker. Coming up, Best Buy backpedals after a pricing backlash for the latest and priciest iPhone X. This is Bloomberg. Best Buy said it stopped some sales of the iPhone X and iPhone 8 after it faced a pricing backlash from consumers. The retailer previously charged a $100 premium on the highly anticipated device that'll hit stores Friday. Best Buy, which is one of Apple's key retail partners, previously said the $100 increase was intentional because offering different purchasing options for iPhones has a cost. Staying with Apple and iPhone, shares closed up over 1% ahead of earnings and the iPhone X's in-store release on Friday. Joining us for all things Apple, Mark Gurman, Bloomberg's consumer tech reporter. So first of all, what do you think about this whole Best Buy situation?
Yeah, it's interesting. We first broke a story on that last week. What they're doing is they were charging $100 more. So instead of the $1,000 price point for the iPhone X, it was $1,100. And they were basically saying that these phones are unactivated. They come at a premium cost because of the unactivation. In reality, what they were doing is they were charging a $100 surcharge based on them saying they're the only ones doing it, which isn't true because Apple does it from its own website, at least for the iPhone 8 as well, and they will do it pretty soon for the iPhone X. Now, they're not doing that anymore. So instead of basically saying, hey, we're not going to charge $100 anymore, they're just not going to sell iPhones at that full price at all because of that.
Interesting. So reviews for the iPhone X coming out. Mostly good, with the exception of some nitpicking around the facial recognition technology. Round it up for us.
Pretty positive so far, but again, reviewers have only been using this for about a day. We're going to get our hands on it on Friday, put it through its paces on Friday, and I will give my opinion next week, hopefully, on it, and let's stay tuned for that.
So what are you looking ahead to in Apple earnings later this week?
It's going to be interesting to see how the iPhone 8 sales, given that there's no iPhone X sales in the Q4 quarter. Usually they have a couple weeks of the biggest new iPhone. Now it's the 8, which had sort of a muted response because people who would line up early for the new iPhone are waiting for the 10 anyways. So we're going to have to see how that affects the iPhone sales numbers and the revenue numbers come Thursday.
And what's your take on how demand will shape up this holiday quarter for both the iPhone 8 and the iPhone X, given supply constraints, to the extent that there are supply constraints?
Right. I think the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus are going to be readily available, as will the older iPhones. The 7s still are on sale, the 6S line and the smaller SE phones. You can order one on Apple's website right now, and you'll get it by Friday when the 10 comes out. If you order a 10 right now, it's 5 to 6 weeks in every region except in Hong Kong. You have to buy it in a store. They shut off online sales because the demand was so high there. 5 to 6 weeks, it'll probably go down from there. But the question is how long will that 5 to 6 week time for waiting period last? Will that go all the way till December? Will you have to wait until February, March to get a phone if you order in December, Christmas time? We'll have to wait and see.
Apple's answer to Amazon Echo and Google Home also coming out in December. How do you expect that to sell?
Yeah, I mean, for $350, it's the upper pricing echelon of these smart speakers. Sonos came out with a really nice one for $200 a couple weeks ago. I've been testing it at home. It's actually quite good. Amazon has a slew of new Echoes coming out for Christmas time. So at $350, Apple has some competition, and they're much more expensive. But we'll get our hands on it when it comes out, and we'll see how well it fares.
All right, Mark Gurman, always great to have you here with the Roundup. Thanks so much for joining us. Of course, we're looking ahead to Apple earnings later this week. We will be all over that. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. A reminder, we are live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Bloomberg Tech TV weekdays, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. That is all for now. This is Bloomberg.